The sun rose high over the quiet suburbs of Greenfield, casting warm rays across well-manicured lawns and tree-lined streets. Ethan Blake adjusted his tie as he settled into the driver's seat of his navy blue sedan. At 44 years old, Ethan had built a reputation as one of the most formidable federal prosecutors in the country. Known for his integrity and tenacity, he had spent decades fighting for justice for those who had no voice. Today was a rare day off for Ethan, but it wasn't just any day. He had been invited to the wedding of Mayor Jonathan Reed's daughter, a high-profile event in the small but bustling community. Ethan had always admired the mayor for his commitment to diversity and equity, making it a privilege to be on the guest list. As he cruised down the winding suburban roads, Ethan enjoyed the peacefulness of the morning. The faint hum of his car engine was accompanied by the sound of chirping birds and the rustling of trees in the gentle breeze. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, to step out of the courtroom mindset that dominated his life. However, that sense of calm evaporated when a police patrol car emerged ahead, parked haphazardly at the curb. Ethan noticed the officer inside, a man with graying hair and a hard-set jaw, watching each passing vehicle with hawk-like intensity. He thought little of it at first. Probably just monitoring traffic, Ethan muttered to himself. But as he approached, the officer's vehicle suddenly flashed its lights and pulled out into the road, forcing Ethan to stop. Confused but cautious, Ethan parked his car at the side of the road, his mind racing to recall whether he had unknowingly violated any traffic laws. A tall figure emerged from the patrol car and approached Ethan's driver's side window with slow, deliberate steps. The officer, whose name tag read Victor Hargrove, exuded an air of authority that felt less professional and more domineering. Ethan rolled down his window and greeted him politely. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Victor peered at Ethan with narrowed eyes, his expression laced with suspicion. "Morning," he replied gruffly. "What are you doing out here?" Caught off guard by the accusatory tone, Ethan frowned slightly. "I'm on my way to an event. Is there an issue?" Victor's lips curled into a sneer as he surveyed Ethan's suit and car. "An event, huh? What kind of event would someone like you be rushing off to?" Ethan's confusion deepened. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his tone calm but firm. "Officer, if I've done something wrong, I'd appreciate it if you could tell me." "You were speeding," Victor declared abruptly. "License and registration, now." Ethan's brow furrowed further. He knew he hadn't been speeding. The road had been clear, and his speedometer had stayed well below the limit. Still, he handed over his documents without protest. "Officer," Ethan said evenly, "I don't believe I was speeding. If there's evidence, I'd like to see it." Victor's face flushed with irritation. "Are you questioning me?" he barked. "I'm the law here. You think you can just waltz through my town, acting all high and mighty?" Ethan's instincts sharpened. This wasn't just about a traffic violation. There was something far deeper at play. The barely veiled hostility in Victor's tone was impossible to ignore. "I'm not questioning your authority, Officer Hargrove," Ethan replied carefully. "But the law requires that accusations be supported by evidence. Surely you have proof if I was speeding." Victor stepped closer, his imposing figure looming over Ethan through the car window. "You listen here," he snarled, his voice laced with malice. "I don't need proof to deal with someone like you. You think that suit and car make you untouchable?" Ethan's patience began to fray, but his demeanor remained composed. "Officer Hargrove," he said, "I'm simply asking for fairness. If you have no evidence of a violation, I believe this stop is unwarranted." Victor's expression darkened further, his hands balling into fists. "You're pushing your luck," he growled. "Get out of the car, now." Ethan hesitated. "Am I under arrest?" "You're not under anything until I say so," Victor snapped, pounding a fist on the roof of the sedan. "Get out, or I'll drag you out." Ethan's heartbeat quickened, but his voice remained calm. "I'll step out, but I need to know the reason. This seems unnecessary and excessive." Victor didn't answer. His hand hovered near his holster as Ethan cautiously opened the door and stepped onto the asphalt, his movements slow and deliberate. As the officer moved closer, his hostility was palpable. Ethan knew this encounter was far from ordinary, and he would need every ounce of composure to navigate what came next. Ethan stood by his car, his posture calm, but his senses on high alert. Officer Victor Hargrove loomed closer, his presence suffocating. The man's eyes burned with something far more personal than the routine enforcement of traffic laws. "Hands where I can see them," Victor barked, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. Ethan complied, raising his hand slightly. "Officer, I'm unarmed, and I've been cooperative. I'd like to understand why I was stopped and why this has escalated." Victor smirked, shaking his head. "Cooperative, huh? You people are always so good at playing innocent. Think you're smarter than everyone else." Ethan's patience wavered. He knew exactly what Victor meant by "you people." This wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about prejudice, pure and simple. But arguing would only inflame the situation. "I'm not trying to argue with you, Officer Hargrove," Ethan said evenly, "but I have rights, and I'd like to exercise them. If I've broken the law, please provide evidence. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way." Victor's face reddened, his frustration boiling over. "Rights? You think you can lecture me about rights? I've been in this job for 25 years. I know more about the law than you ever will." Ethan kept his gaze steady, his voice calm but firm. "Then you understand that the law applies to everyone, including you. If you continue to abuse your authority, there will be consequences." That was the breaking point. Victor's sneer turned into a snarl, and his hand snapped to his gun. "Consequences? Don't you dare threaten me, you arrogant son of a—" Before he could finish, Ethan took a deliberate step back, his hand still visible. "Officer, I'm not threatening you. I'm reaching for my phone to call someone who can help mediate the situation." Victor's eyes widened in a mixture of anger and panic. "Don't move, don't even think about it." "I'm just calling for help," Ethan reiterated, his tone measured. Slowly, he reached into his pocket. To Victor, it didn't matter. In his mind, the action was a provocation, a challenge to his authority. His hand tightened on his weapon. "Put it down!" Victor shouted, his voice shaking. Ethan froze, his phone in hand. "Officer Hargrove, I'm only holding my phone. There's no threat here." But the words didn't reach Victor. Fueled by adrenaline and years of unchecked bias, he pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the morning quiet. Pain erupted in Ethan's leg as the bullet tore through his thigh. He collapsed onto the asphalt, clutching the wound as warm blood seeped through his fingers. Victor stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, his face a mask of shock and regret. "Why didn't you just listen?" he muttered almost to himself. "You brought this on yourself." Ethan bit back a groan of pain, his mind racing. He needed help, and fast. Gritting his teeth, he pressed his phone's speed dial and waited as it rang. On the other end, Mayor Jonathan Reed's familiar voice answered. "Ethan? What's going on?" "Mayor Reed," Ethan said, his voice strained but steady. "I've been shot. A police officer pulled me over and used excessive force. I need you to come immediately." The mayor's tone shifted to alarm. "Where are you? Are you safe?" Ethan relayed his location before hanging up. Despite the agony, he managed to stay composed. Victor, meanwhile, began to pace, his gun now holstered, but his hands trembling. "Who did you just call?" Victor demanded, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "The mayor," Ethan replied evenly. "I was on my way to his daughter's wedding. Now, I'm sure he'll want to know why I didn't make it." Victor's face paled. For the first time, the gravity of his actions seemed to register. The distant wail of sirens broke through the silence, growing louder by the second. Within moments, 3 vehicles arrived: the mayor's black SUV, the sheriff's department cruiser, and an ambulance. Mayor Reed stepped out first, his face a mix of concern and disbelief as he spotted Ethan on the ground. "Ethan!" he exclaimed, rushing to his side. "What happened?" Ethan looked up at him, his voice calm despite the pain. "I was pulled over without cause. When I tried to call for help, the officer shot me." Sheriff Amanda Gray followed close behind, her piercing gaze locking onto Victor. "Officer Hargrove," she said coldly, "explain yourself." "Now." Victor stammered, his composure unraveling. He reached for something. I thought it was a weapon. I acted in self-defense." Amanda's sharp eyes narrowed. "Was he armed?" Victor hesitated, his silence damning. Mayor Reed's voice was low but firm. "Sheriff, I want a full investigation. This is unacceptable." Amanda nodded. "Consider it done." Turning to Victor, she added, "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your gun and badge." Victor's face crumpled, but he complied, handing over his weapon as paramedics attended to Ethan. The road was now a scene of chaos, but for Ethan, it was only the beginning. The tension on the suburban street was palpable as paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Ethan. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage wrapped around his leg, but his expression remained calm, his resolve unshaken. Mayor Jonathan Reed stood nearby, his face etched with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Sheriff Gray," he said firmly, "this incident must be handled with complete transparency. I want every detail accounted for." Sheriff Amanda Gray nodded. "I assure you, Mayor, this won't be swept under the rug. Officer Hargrove will face the full weight of the law if wrongdoing is confirmed." Victor Hargrove stood a few feet away, his badge and gun now surrendered. His hands trembled at his sides and his face was pale. He avoided looking at Ethan, as though the mere sight of the injured man magnified his guilt. Ethan, still lying on the stretcher, turned his head toward the mayor. "Jonathan," he said, his voice steady despite the pain, "this isn't just about me. It's about what people like Hargrove represent. If we don't address this now, others will suffer the same abuse." Mayor Reed placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You have my word, Ethan. We'll get to the bottom of this." The paramedics began to load Ethan into the ambulance. As the doors closed, he gave a nod to Sheriff Gray. "Make sure the truth comes out," he said before the vehicle sped off toward the hospital. Back at the sheriff's office, Amanda Gray wasted no time. She called an emergency meeting with her senior staff and internal affairs. "We need to move swiftly," she announced. "This case isn't just about one officer, it's about the credibility of our entire department." The video footage from Ethan's dashboard camera was quickly retrieved and submitted for analysis. As Amanda and her team watched the video, the damning evidence unfolded. The footage showed Ethan driving well below the speed limit before being abruptly stopped by Victor's patrol car. From the moment Victor approached Ethan, his hostility was evident. "You think you're better than everyone else with that fancy suit and car?" Victor's voice sneered on the recording. Ethan's calm response was also captured. "Officer, I haven't broken any laws. I'd appreciate it if you could explain why I'm being stopped." The video then showed Victor's escalating aggression, his refusal to provide evidence, and his eventual decision to draw his weapon as Ethan reached for his phone. It ended with a horrifying moment when Victor pulled the trigger. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her jaw clenched. "This is worse than I expected," she said. Her deputy, Michael Rowan, shook his head in disbelief. "The footage is clear. There's no justification for his actions. He escalated the situation without cause." Amanda nodded. "File a formal report and suspend Victor Hargrove without pay, pending the investigation. Notify the DA's office. This is going to trial." Meanwhile, the news of the shooting spread rapidly. By the next morning, the local media was ablaze with headlines. "Federal prosecutor shot by local officer, racial bias under scrutiny." Community leaders and activists quickly organized protests outside the sheriff's office, demanding accountability. Mayor Reed addressed the press that afternoon. Standing on the courthouse steps, he spoke with conviction. "This incident is a tragedy, and it underscores the urgent need for reform. I want to make it clear, no one is above the law. Officer Hargrove will be held accountable, and we will ensure that justice is served." The mayor's words resonated, but they also intensified public scrutiny. Questions arose about how Victor Hargrove had remained on the force for so long, despite allegations of misconduct in the past. Ethan, now recovering in the hospital, watched the news coverage from his bed. Though grateful for the support pouring in from across the community, he couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. Later that day, Amanda Gray visited him in the hospital. "Mr. Blake," she began, her tone respectful but serious, "we've reviewed the dash cam footage. It's damning. Victor Hargrove's actions were not only unprofessional, they were criminal. He'll be facing charges of assault with a deadly weapon and abuse of authority." Ethan regarded her calmly. "Thank you, Sheriff, but this goes beyond Hargrove. This is about a system that allows people like him to thrive unchecked. What are you doing to prevent this from happening again?" Amanda hesitated before replying. You're right. We've started reviewing our training programs and protocols, especially regarding racial bias. But it's a long road ahead. Change won't come overnight. Ethan's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. It's a start, but don't lose sight of what's at stake. People need to believe in the system, or it all falls apart. Amanda nodded solemnly. We'll make it right, Mr. Blake, I promise. As she left the room, Ethan stared out the window, the weight of the moment settling over him. He knew this was far from over. The fight for justice was just beginning. 2 weeks after the incident, the trial of Officer Victor Hargrove began. The courtroom buzzed with tension as reporters, community leaders, and civil rights advocates filled every available seat. Mayor Jonathan Reed sat in the front row, his presence a clear statement of solidarity with Ethan Blake and a commitment to ensuring accountability. Ethan entered the courtroom on crutches, his face calm but resolute. His injury had healed significantly, but the psychological scars lingered. As a federal prosecutor, Ethan was no stranger to the legal process, yet sitting on the witness stand as a victim brought a profound new perspective. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michelle Hayes, wasted no time laying out the case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this is not just about an officer who made a terrible decision. This is about a pattern of abuse, unchecked power, and the dangerous consequences of prejudice. Michelle presented the dashcam footage, which played on a large screen before the silent courtroom. The video laid bare Victor's aggression and prejudice, his sneering comments, and his refusal to provide any evidence for his accusations. The moment when Victor drew his gun and shot Ethan sent a visible ripple of discomfort through the jury. Ethan took the stand next, his testimony clear and precise. I complied with every instruction Officer Hargrove gave me, he stated. When I reached for my phone, I made it explicitly clear that I was calling for help. At no point did I present a threat. Michelle guided him through the events of that day, allowing Ethan to paint a vivid picture of the encounter. Mr. Blake, she asked, in your professional opinion, was Officer Hargrove's behavior consistent with the principles of law enforcement? Ethan's gaze was steady. No, he replied. As someone who has worked alongside law enforcement for decades, I can say with confidence that his actions were not only unprofessional, but also unlawful. The defense attorney, Scott Ralston, attempted to counter by arguing that Victor acted out of fear for his safety. Officer Hargrove perceived a threat, he said, addressing the jury. He made a split-second decision in a high-pressure situation. However, Michelle was quick to dismantle this argument. Fear alone is not an excuse for recklessness, she countered. Victor Hargrove had 25 years of experience. He should have been able to discern the difference between a phone and a weapon, especially when Mr. Blake was cooperative and clearly unarmed. The turning point came when Michelle introduced additional evidence. Victor's internal records, which revealed multiple complaints of misconduct and racially charged comments over his career. Though these complaints had been dismissed or overlooked, they painted a damning picture of a man who had long abused his authority. As the trial stretched into its third day, Victor Hargrove took the stand. He appeared weary and defensive, his voice lacking the bravado he had shown during the traffic stop. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Victor said, his tone almost pleading. I thought he was reaching for a weapon. I was just trying to protect myself. Michelle pressed him on the inconsistencies in his account. Officer Hargrove, the video shows that Mr. Blake clearly stated he was reaching for his phone. Did you hear that? Victor hesitated. I didn't process it at the time. Isn't it true, Michelle continued, that your actions were influenced not by a genuine threat, but by your own biases? Biases that are evident in your language and conduct throughout the stop? Victor had no answer. His silence spoke volumes. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts, including assault with a deadly weapon and abuse of authority. The sentence was harsh but justified. 10 years in prison, along with restitution payments to Ethan for his medical bills and emotional distress. As the judge announced the decision, a hush fell over the courtroom. Victor slumped in his chair, his face a mixture of regret and resignation. Ethan, meanwhile, felt a surge of relief, not for himself, but for what the verdict represented, a step toward accountability. Outside the courthouse, Mayor Reed addressed the press. Today's verdict sends a clear message. No one is above the law. This is a moment of reckoning, not just for one individual, but for the systems that allowed this behavior to go unchecked for so long. We have much work to do. Ethan, standing beside him, echoed the sentiment. This is not a personal victory, he said. It's a victory for justice. But justice isn't a destination. It's a journey. We must remain vigilant to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did. In the days that followed, Sheriff Amanda Gray implemented sweeping reforms within the department. Training programs were revamped to focus on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Officers were held to higher standards of accountability, and an independent oversight committee was established to review complaints of misconduct. The community, though still grappling with the aftermath, began to heal. Protests turned into forums for dialogue, where citizens and law enforcement worked together to rebuild trust. For Ethan, the trial was over, but his mission was far from complete. He became a vocal advocate for systemic reform, using his platform to highlight the importance of accountability and transparency. "We can't change the past," Ethan said during a televised interview, "but we can shape the future. And the future I want is one where justice truly serves everyone." Months after the trial, Greenfield was a town in transition. The echoes of protests and demands for justice had given way to discussions of reform and reconciliation. Sheriff Amanda Gray worked tirelessly to implement changes within the police department, determined to root out prejudice and restore trust. One of the most significant reforms was the establishment of a civilian oversight committee composed of local citizens, legal experts, and community leaders. Their task was to review police conduct complaints and ensure transparency in disciplinary actions. Mandatory de-escalation training and bias awareness workshops became standard for all officers, with zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. At a community town hall, Amanda addressed the crowd. "The events that brought us here were painful and unjust, but from pain we must find purpose. Every officer who wears this badge must understand that they are here to protect and serve, not to dominate or oppress." Her words were met with cautious optimism. For some, trust would take years to rebuild, but for others, the changes represented hope. Meanwhile, Ethan Blake had fully recovered from his physical injuries, though the emotional scars lingered. He had become a sought-after speaker at legal conferences and civil rights events, sharing his story to highlight the urgency of systemic reform. During an interview with a national news anchor, Ethan reflected on the journey. "What happened to me isn't unique," he said. "That's the most tragic part. But it's also why we can't let this moment pass without demanding change. Justice isn't just about punishing one bad actor. It's about fixing the systems that enable them." Ethan's message resonated widely. Activists, legal experts, and even law enforcement officials began using his case as a blueprint for addressing misconduct and rebuilding public trust. 1 year later, Ethan was invited to speak at a ceremony honoring individuals who had contributed to justice reform. The event was held in Greenfield, a fitting reminder of where his story had begun. Taking the stage, Ethan looked out at the crowd, faces of every age, background, and belief, united by a shared hope for a better future. "Injustice doesn't just harm the victim," Ethan began. "It harms all of us by eroding the principles we claim to stand for. But justice, true justice, has the power to heal. It demands courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." He paused, his gaze settling on a group of young students in the front row. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "It's a long and often painful journey, but every step we take brings us closer to a world where fairness and equality aren't just ideals, they're realities." The audience erupted into applause as Ethan stepped down, greeted by Mayor Jonathan Reed and Sheriff Amanda Gray. "Your words carry weight, Ethan," Jonathan said, "and your actions have made a real difference." Ethan smiled faintly. "It's a start, but there's still so much to do." Back at his office, Ethan sifted through stacks of letters from people across the country, victims of injustice, families seeking answers, and advocates for reform. Each story reinforced his commitment to the cause. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was from a young law student who wrote, "Mr. Blake, your courage inspired me to pursue a career in law. I want to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, just like you did. Thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference." Ethan folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, his resolve stronger than ever. In the years that followed, Greenfield became a model for other towns grappling with similar challenges. The reforms initiated in the wake of Victor Hargrove's actions set a precedent for accountability and equity in law enforcement. Ethan continued his work as a federal prosecutor, but he had become more than that, a symbol of resilience and a champion for justice. Through his efforts, he reminded the world that while prejudice and abuse of power might persist, so too would the fight against them. And in that fight, there was always hope.